Hello, you are all very, very welcome to this, which is the launch of Anthony Harvey's new book, How Linguistics Can Help the Historian. I hope you can all hear me, and you're all welcome from all around the world. We've had over 280, 290 people booking in for this, which we're delighted with. I'm Ruth Hegarty, and I run the publishing house of the Royal Irish Academy. And when I read this manuscript, when Anthony sent it to me, I was so struck by some of his word sleuthing examples that when I was reading it, I would laugh and go, oh, I hadn't thought of that. And, you know, I hadn't quite ever thought of that before. And he made me laugh. So we had to publish this book. We're recording this event just so that you know that at the questions and answers stage. And we'll post it on our YouTube channel next week. If you have a question that occurs to you at any stage at all, please put it in the Q&A. You'll find that probably at the bottom of your screen. If you roll over, you'll see a Q&A there. And if it occurs to you during it, just pop it in there and we'll pass it on to Dónal, who is our presenter this evening. And I'm delighted that he was able to take over from me because you'll be in capable hands. So I'm going to ask him now to turn on his video and to unmute himself. And Dónal, can I hand over to you to take over the evening? You need to unmute yourself there.
My apologies, everyone. Thank you, Ruth, and good evening to you all. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here to this virtual event to launch Anthony's book. It's always a pleasure to meet a passionate academic or somebody who's working in a particularly obscure area who can bring both passion and accessibility to a project. And he certainly has done this with his book, How Linguistics Can Help the Historian. By way of introduction, Anthony is the editor of the Royal Irish Academy's Dictionary of Medieval Latin from Celtic sources. He's also, as I've discovered having read his book, a sort of linguistic Howard Carter going into the Valley of the Kings in terms of things that might otherwise have been totally inaccessible to the rest of us or indeed have been lost. So I'm going to welcome Anthony. First of all, it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm sorry, as I'm sure you all are, that it couldn't have been a more convivial and social occasion when we all might have gathered. But as Anthony has pointed out, the RIA couldn't have accommodated the number of people who have actually joined us this evening, which is fantastic for Anthony, and thank you all for joining. We'll start, Anthony, if we may, with what you call calendrical confusion. July and August, we know, are months named after Roman emperors, but things go a little strange after that.
Yes, that's right. Thank you very much, Dónal. I hope everyone can hear me okay. Most people know that July and August are named after those two emperors, and they're aware that the other names of the months are older than that. But have you ever thought about what the months actually meant originally, their names? Think of the last 4 months of the year: September, October, November, December. Those are months numbered 9, 10, 11, and 12, aren't they? But sept normally means 7. Think of septuplets. Oct normally means 8, as in octogenarian. Nov normally means 9, as in novena. And dec or des normally means 10, as in December. And yet those are now, they've been shifted by 2 places, haven't they? Those months have been moved on by 2 slots each from where they once were. So we know why this happened. We know that there was a reorganization of the calendar in 153 BC, long before the renaming of the 2 months after the emperors. That was a separate thing. But even if we hadn't known about, if we hadn't had historical records of the shift, here's the point: we would still have been able to work out that it must have happened by analyzing or just being aware of the meanings of the names of those 4 months. So it's like in archaeology, if people are digging and they find a layer of ash, that is a sign that there was a fire at some point in the past. There's the event, there's the marker of the event. Well, in the same way, the fact that these etymologies are baked into those 4 month names tells us, even if we didn't have a record of it, it tells us that those months have each been shifted by 2 slots. So this is the kind of thing that I wanted to draw attention to. There is evidence. It's like archaeological evidence. There's linguistic evidence lying around on the surface of our language landscape. It's just a question of noticing it, really. And it's very interesting when one finds these, I think, and I just wanted to share a bit of that.
Well, what was your conclusion, having looked at the juxtaposition of those months?
Well, as I say, that you could see that there was this block of 4 that had been moved, and they had been moved by 2 places. You could get that just by working out what the original etymologies of their names were.
And what was the inspiration for the book itself, Anthony? How did the idea come about?
Well, the reason for the book was that during COVID, the Royal Irish Academy has been shuttered, and we have all been working from home. People might think that the Academy was not doing anything, and it was important to show that we were all still beavering away at our jobs. But as for the content of it, it began with a nice invitation I had from Cumann Stare, the Historical Society of NUI Galway, who invited me to come and talk about these things. So I did a while back. And then after that, there was a workshop at the Royal Society of Antiquaries of Ireland. And it just seemed to me a nice possibility to get this down in simple terms, what people sometimes think is a complicated subject, but it isn't. It's just interesting, and I wanted to make people as widely aware of that as possible. So that's what prompted it, really.
And what are the wider applications of linguistics and history in your view?
Well, historians are generally, I think, increasingly aware of the way other disciplines can help them with their work. I've mentioned archaeology already. Archaeology can corroborate historical theories or conclusions, or disprove them as well, of course. But the point is this: so can linguistics. Done properly, linguistics is a science, and it can give results which are as precise and as concrete as anything that you could get if you dug up a piece of ceramic. It's a question of interpreting it properly. Linguistic evidence is solid stuff.
On the question of linguistic evidence, let's turn to the Strasbourg Oaths. First of all, relatively obscure, but very important in your view. So what were they and why were they important?
Yes, well, there's a bit of an anecdote here. When Charlemagne, that great emperor, died in the early 9th century, things fell apart a bit politically in what had been his realm. And the part of the empire which lay to the west, and which subsequently became France, West Francia, found itself at loggerheads with the part of the empire which lay to the east and which became Germany. That was East Francia. And they came close to war, and it was all settled in the end, at least temporarily, at the Treaty of Verdun in 843. But before that, there had been an agreement reached between the 2 rulers, that was King Charles of the French part and King Ludwig of the German part. And they gathered their armies together in Strasbourg in 842 and signed this treaty of friendship, really, and it worked. And the interesting thing is this: we have the text of the oath that they took, the oath of allegiance that they took to each other, the oath of alliance, and we have it in the 2 languages, early German, and also a language which was well on the way to becoming French. And this is the first document in French that exists and that we have. And it seems to have been devised especially for the occasion. So that would be interesting enough in its own right, but there's more to it. So will I go into the
yes, please
theoretically rather complicated detail, but follow this, because this is where it all gets interesting. At first sight, one might think that so you had the 2 armies not facing off each other, but these were each other's potential enemies, and they heard their 2 kings addressing them, and the German troops heard the oath of alliance read out to them in German, and the French troops, let's call them that, heard the same thing read out to them in French, and that was great because this was in their own language, and that would have made them feel confident. But it was better than
a diplomatic triumph there.
Diplomatic triumph. But the thing is, it's better than that, and here's the reason. If you look at the French text, it's written in as I say, recognizably early French. But French is the direct descendant of the Latin language. And Latin spelling was fixed and had been for several hundred years, but the pronunciation of it had been changing. But someone on the French side then who was trying to read out a Latin text would pronounce it in a way that to us would sound like French. It would come out as French. If you took the same Latin text to Spain at the time, and you asked someone to read it out, they would read it out thinking it was their own language, and it would be, but it would sound to us like early Spanish. In Italy, it would sound like early Italian. The point was that the Latin language as written was pronounced in these different ways in the different places, which were on the way to becoming the modern vernacular languages of French and Italian and Spanish and so on. So for the French ruler, King Charles, to have read out the text in French to his people, all he would have needed to do would be read out a document written in Latin, and it would have come out in pronunciation as, well, very early French. So what was the point of having this phonetically written document in what is recognizable to us as early French? Well, it's clear that it was written for a foreigner. If we had an English document in which we had the word tough and we spelt it T-U-F-F, and if we had the word knife and we had spelt it without the K, you'd ask why we would be doing that. Well, to help someone who wasn't familiar with the language. And that's what was going on here. The French version was written in what is recognizably French for the German ruler to read out. And the German was read out by the French ruler. So the diplomatic triumph was even better than one might think. Each of these bodies of troops heard friendly words read out to them by the leader of their own potential enemies. So that was
presumably really a powerful impact.
A really powerful impact. And the thing is, we know that it worked because the troops did stand down and peace was secured, at least for a while. And here was the spin-off, though. That first exercise at writing what is recognizably French, written in a kind of phonetic way for a foreigner, for a one-off diplomatic important occasion, set the ball in motion for the French language to be written as a separate thing from Latin. And it went on in an unbroken way to lead to the modern French language way of writing French now. I mean, take the word for before. In French now, avant. In Latin, it would have been written at that time A-B-A-N-T-E. And in the French text that we have from Strasbourg in 842, for the first time ever, it's written A-V-A-N-T.
So how important a developmental step in the language is this?
Well, it led to ultimately the tradition of writing in French. And so it set the standard for education systems around a very large proportion of the world today. So
and can you just fill us in on how this riddle of the Strasbourg oaths was solved originally?
The rubric, there's a rubric in the text which does indicate that the kings had swapped languages for the purpose, but that's the kind of thing which one would regard as probably folklore and just a sort of a thrill to the thing and unlikely to be true. It's when you realize that spelling it in this phonetic only needs to be read out by someone to whom it was a foreign language, because, as I say, the French ruler would have read out Latin in the way that would have been desired and would have come out with the the V sound if he saw A-B-A-N-T-E, he would have pronounced it with a V, and that's what his people needed to hear. So it wouldn't have made any sense for the spelling to be this new type of spelling, unless it was to be read out by the man whose language, to whom the language is foreign.
Okay, and just on that point of the Latin pronunciation, that takes us to Battling Andrew, the Irishman. If you can tell us his rather intriguing story.
Yes, this is a funny one. This was a little earlier, but still at the Carolingian court. A man called Cathach Andrew, at least sort of nickname he has, it seems to mean Battling Andrew, had come from Ireland, as did many other learned Irishmen, to the Carolingian court, where there was a heady mix of scholarship going on. And we don't know a huge amount about him, except that he's mocked in a poem by another of the courtiers there, a Frank called Theodulf. And what Theodulf is mocking him for is his strange pronunciation of Latin, which led Andrew into the misfortune of apparently saying, he meant to say Scotus sum, I am an Irishman, I am a Gaelic speaker, but what he actually seems to have said was sotus sum, I am a sot, a drunken fool. And of course, this was hilarious, and he got roundly mocked, but not just for that, but for pronouncing all examples of the letter C as a S. So instead of saying Scotus, he had said sotus, but it seemed that instead of scando, I ascend, he had said sando, and so on. And the question is why he did that. No one else did that. And until recently, the modern scholarly view was that it was something to do with his having had an Irish accent. And that led to the poem being mistranslated by modern scholars as if Theodulf was saying, this Irishman, what are the Irish like? An Irishman will never be anything but an Irishman, in a sort of a mocking kind of way, the sort of anti-Irish sentiment or belittling sentiment which we get all too frequently these days. But it turns out that it wasn't that at all. And the proof of that is, again, we think what the realities of pronunciation would have been at that time. There is nothing about an Irish accent which prevents one from saying the sound k. After all, there are plenty of words rather like scando and scotus within Irish. Think of a skia, a shield, or cosk, or scunon. There's just no problem about it, and never has been. So what was it that prompted this man Andrew to start pronouncing his Latin in a way that no one else did? Well, it seems to be this.
So essentially, Anthony, what you're saying is in terms of linguistics, it's a matter of not taking things for granted, and certainly not taking things at face value as they seem, perhaps particularly in translation, for example.
Yes, that's exactly right. We need to see what words meant at the time they were being used. And we also need to work out how they were pronounced. It's a great shame when people just read out something, as if the pronunciation didn't matter, because it can be at the heart of what's going on. It turns out that what Andrew did was he had noticed that whereas in Ireland everyone pronounced the letter C as k always, on the continent they pronounced it as s in certain environments, such as in the word which became science in French, but scientia as it had been in classical Latin. Mm-hmm. And his mistake was that he wanted to try to fit in. So he'd started pronouncing the letter C as S in all environments in a way that no one else did. So he was trying to fit in, and he'd overdone it. He'd overshot the mark. And so what he's being mocked for is not for being Irish or having an Irish accent, but for pretending not to be Irish. This is why I described it as the West Brit syndrome, 1,200 years ago.
I knew we were going to find ourselves back with the months of the year, and July and August. We have a question from Thomas Clarty here. Do we know why the months were actually moved then?
The beginning of the year was moved. January and February, but not called that, had originally been at the end of the year, and they were shunted round to the beginning, which brought these other four forward. It brought all the months. They were all shifted by 2, but the 4 months I was talking about are the only ones with numbers built into their names, as it were. So they're the ones which can show that this was what was going on. And it was a reorganization of the calendar, the usual thing to bring things back in line with the moon, because the moon is a tiresome thing. It's not exactly 30 days or anything. That they'd adjusted things.
Okay, we have another interesting question about how oral history in particular might benefit from linguistics.
Well, it's a question of exactly what is meant by oral history, of course, but I take it that what's meant there is what has been passed down and never been written.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Presumably, yeah.
Presumably. Well, it's the usual thing of working out what was originally meant by a particular word. Sometimes one can in children's nursery rhymes and so on. The one that's very well known, I suppose, by everybody is "Ring a ring a roses, pocket full of posies," which sounds harmless enough, but was to do with the illness of was it the plague? I think. Mm-hmm. The marks that came on people. It's a question of working out what the words originally meant at the time they were first used.
Okay, so are we talking about something which can be lost in translation, or again, going back to your original point, not accepting anything at face value?
Yes, there's no particular skill to it, really. I think it's just a question of asking oneself, if a word seems odd, did it mean that originally? And can I look at the etymology of that word? Take the word apart, look at the bits of it, as we did with the September, the October, and so on. And we may find that some sort of an answer is staring us in the face then, but we just haven't noticed it because it's hidden in plain sight all the time.
Could we talk a little, Anthony, about place names and what they reveal for us?
Yes, the thing about a place name is that if it is survived, number one is that there's always a reason for a place name. No place is named at random. There's always a historical reason, either accessible or inaccessible to us. And another good thing is that if it has survived, it will probably have stayed in the same place. So to use that metaphor of archaeology again, it's like a monolith. Even an unimportant place name of a small field, it won't have moved probably. So it's like a huge stone that can't be moved. It's there, and we can look at the patterns of names on the landscape, for example.
So a hill will always be there, or a river, or a bend in a river, whatever it is, gives the essence of the name.
Yes, and the name will then not move. That's the point. But sometimes they do, but not often. If a thing has a name and the name survives, the name may die out altogether and be replaced by something else. But if it does survive, it's unlikely to move. And an example I like to think of there is, if you look at the map of England, you can see that the old straight Roman roads radiate out from London, because even in times of the Roman occupation, London was effectively already the capital. And one of these is the A5, as it is known now, Watling Street as it was, and that's London to Holyhead. And someone traveling from Ireland to London, if we're ever able to do this again, which we hope we will, you get on the ferry at Dublin Port, you get off at Holyhead, and if you drive to London, ignore the motorways, just stay on the A5. And as you pass through the Midlands near Birmingham, if you just have a look at the road signs, you will see that the ones pointing to the left, that is to the northeast of your path, tend to be names like Kirby or Ravensthorpe or Buckby. And the ones on the right, that is to your southwest, they're places called Shilton and Hunningham and Wolfhamcott, names like that. That's significant because By and Thorpe, the ones to your northeast, the language, they're in a different language. They're in what was Old Norse originally, the language of the Vikings. Whereas looking down to your right, down towards the southwest of England, ton and ham and cot, those are English, as in Old English, Anglo-Saxon. And this road seems to divide the two, not absolutely cleanly, of course, but enough to notice on a map if one is looking at it with intent. And the reason turns out to be because when the Vikings came over, at first it was smash and grab raids, as everyone knows, but then they did settle down and they did take over large parts of England. And there was a period when there was an agreed frontier between the Danelaw, as it was called, the Viking occupied territory to the northeast, and what was left in English hands to the southwest of that, and the boundary was that road. So we know that from documentary history, but even if we didn't, looking at the map, one could see that the names weren't distributed randomly. This road does seem to divide the two, and that's why it was.
Okay, let's take another question, Anthony, from Sonia, who says there's an English word, gift. Obviously, we all recognize that, meaning a present in modern times. In the German language, she guesses it was the origin of this word, means poison. She's always had this image in her mind that perhaps an English present, perhaps sent to Germany, was indeed a poison destined for somebody to be done away with. Will we ever know when words in the far past changed their original meaning?
Yes, I mean, I'm not a Germanic linguist, so I can't answer you straight off on that. But I think probably that is what's called a false friend. You know, it looks as if it's the same word, but it probably is something different. The words in German related to give have a b, where you have a v, where you have a v in English, as in give. I mean, it's just been devoiced by the T coming after, because you can't say gived, you have to say gift. The fundamental sound in the English there is v, and that corresponds to a b in German. So geben, gibt, you know, gab, that's the word that corresponds to give. So I think that the German word for poison, gift, is probably, but Germanic linguists know this. I'm having to extrapolate and guess, but I think that is probably something different.
Okay.
But that does make an interesting point, though, that one can see systematic correspondences between sounds in one language and sounds in another. They're not coincidence. They're because languages develop according to rules, which I think is wonderful. The speakers are unaware of them, and and things change gradually from generation to generation, but you can deduce what the rules are, and you can get somewhere like that.
Okay, another specific curiosity from Roxanne Reddington Wild, who wonders about one of her great linguistic puzzlements, that the varying words for cheese in Gaelic, English and German all seem to be derived from the Latin caseus. Surely the Gaels and Germanic people, she asks, were making cheese before the Romans ever came on the scene. So what's the basic word for cheese in these languages derived from Latin?
Yes, that's a good question. It's true. The Latin word is caseus, and these others are related to it. Do they derive from it, or are they all jointly derived from something which came from further back than that? I can't answer the question without looking things up. But
okay.
But again, this is the thing. If you get words which are related to each other and do mean the same thing in different languages, then that's usually because either one has borrowed from another, or else it's because these languages all descend from a commoner, and whatever concept we're talking about may have been around as far back as that. So that gives some historical depth to it as well. So, and by the way, I would just want to say thanks to Roxanne from that. Here is an example of someone tuning in from the other side of the Atlantic for this thing this evening, which we wouldn't have been able to do if we had been having to gather physically.
Another question from Bridine. thanking you for a very interesting talk. And could Anthony comment on words for colour, where one word might refer to more than one colour, example, glass in Irish, meaning both green and grey, depending on the context. And she'd like to hear your thoughts on whether this phenomenon might be due to linguistic development, cultural bias, or perhaps perceptual limits.
I would have thought it's not so much perceptual limits as perceptual differences depending on the culture. I mean, we talk about there being 7 colours in the rainbow, don't we? But it's not as if they're divided up by sort of the black lines that children would sometimes, when they're drawing a rainbow, they would sometimes, you know, put a pencil line between one colour and the next. In fact, of course, it's a smooth transition from one to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And it seems that different cultures see the divisions between the colours as falling in different. Some people group together, or some peoples group together the blues and the greens as a single thing, and others make distinctions that aren't made by us. So it's a cultural thing, and the languages reflect what those cultural things, what the cultural perceptions are.
What advice, Anthony, would you give the historian today, either setting out on a career or perhaps people advanced in their careers, about reconsidering linguistics and the work that they do?
The first thing I would ask them to do is not be frightened by it. People, I find sometimes I know people who are keen on maths find the same thing. They try to introduce other people, interest other people in mathematics, and people say, "Oh, I wouldn't understand that," and in a way, don't even try. I would encourage people just to enjoy the prospect of getting into this, because doesn't have to be that difficult or complicated. Just be alert, keep your eyes and ears open, and look for patterns. Even if you buy this is something that has occurred to me. If you buy a new little electronic device or something like that, and you look at the instructions and you see that they're in lots of different languages, take 2 of the languages which you know are related to each other, like Danish and Swedish and Norwegian. Often you have those 3 on there. And it's easy, without knowing anything of those languages. I don't know anything of those languages, but I have noticed, for example, that where Swedish has a T and it's a K, Danish tends to have a D and a G, sort of softer, more voiced sound, perhaps, or at least the letters look like that. And it's systematic. Just look for the patterns. You can easily see what the patterns are, and then explore whether you've got it right or not.
And an important question here relates to translation, Anthony. How wary should the professional be in dealing with translations? Because, as you point out, translators themselves are subject to a number of influences.
They are, aren't they? Yes. And the example I gave of the translation of the poem that mocked Battling Andrew is one of those. But the modern scholar, the modern Oxford scholar who translated that as, the line in that as an Irishman is nothing but an Irishman. That's how he translated it, as a general anti-Irish thing. When in fact what it meant was, this man, and it was specifically Catholic Andreas, not other Irish people, this man will never be anything but an Irishman. And his message to him was, there's nothing to be ashamed of. Get over it. Stop pretending not to be one. So yes, I mean, obviously a good translator will do the very best they can, but they're bound to be influenced. They're part of their culture, just as the original composer was, and as the final listener or reader is. But if one can get closer to the original oneself, it's always worth at least trying to do, I think.
Would it help, for example, rather than accepting something at face value, even subject matter which might be familiar to the historian or the curious person, seeking out the advice of a linguist to see if there's something in there that's slightly cryptic or doesn't match up, or something indeed worth exploring further that doesn't seem immediately obvious?
I think it's always worth bringing as many disciplines as possible to bear on any problem, really. If there's a question, try and try and see what other aspects there may be. I've mentioned already how archaeology is known by historians to be helpful. Yeah, and interdisciplinarity is so important. We all need to realize when there's something there but we don't know what it is, ask someone who does know, because there will be somebody.
A question from Helen, who'd like you to comment on tracing the movements of people from Britain to Ireland, when they came and from where, based on different dialects and the pronunciation of English spoken in different places today.
Yeah, I mean that's great, isn't it? And I know that certain aspects of the pronunciation of English in Ireland seem to be related to places in England where those people or their ancestors originally came from, and work goes into this. But of course,
could you give us some examples of those?
The retention of the sound r. You know how the sort of stereotype of the English speaker is someone who doesn't pronounce the R at the end of a word and says water and so on. And if the next word begins with a vowel, they will put a r in there, even if there isn't one, such as India and Ceylon or India and Sri Lanka, something like that. And the English are rightly mocked for this, although not all English people do that, of course. The r sound used to be found throughout English and still is, for example, down in Devon and Somerset, and so on. And in northeast Manchester as well. I mean, pockets of it survive. And throughout Ireland, the r is pronounced. The absence of it spread from London and Essex, and it's still spreading now, pushing its way west across England. But this deletion of the r sound hasn't reached all parts of Britain. It hasn't reached Ireland at all. And of course, across the Atlantic, almost all dialects of American English, North American English, still pronounce the r very strongly. Although it does seem to be a city-based thing where it does tend to disappear. There are parts of, London is a classic example of where the r has disappeared, but it seems to have done in some inner city pronunciations in Dublin, and New York, after all, they don't pronounce the r there. So there seems to be some connection with towns, but that's probably just sheer coincidence. Geographically speaking, it's the deletion of the r which has spread from England, eastern England, westwards, and it's still going on.
Okay, and how much of the language we speak as English today can we attribute or root back, if you like, to Britain?
Most of it, of course, but particular Irish words have got into the English of Ireland, into Hiberno English, and phrases have as well, and idioms, and even the syntax. Most of these are rather stereotypical, but things like he saw her yesterday and herself on her way to such and such. That would never be heard of in England, but here it's a direct translation from what one would say in Irish.
Well, Anthony, thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for this evening. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. I hope you found it as enjoyable and fascinating as I did. I'd like to invite Anthony to say a few words briefly to all of those who've joined in this evening.
Yes, well, thank you very much, Dónal, and big thanks to you as well, and to Ruth and the other people in the Royal Irish Academy staff who have made this possible. The production of the book and also this occasion this evening. It's been a team effort, and more people are involved than one might think, so I really appreciate that. And I would like to thank as well friends and colleagues who have been sending in good wishes. It's nice to see names that in the attendance list here, some people who I haven't been in touch with for years, and they've got in touch, so that's great and very much appreciated. If this had been in the academy, obviously some people wouldn't have been able to come, the transatlantic visitors, and those who could would have been given a glass of wine. This has had to be a virtual occasion, I'm afraid, So all the more thanks to you for coming anyway. That shows real commitment. Thank you.
Well, cheers, Anthony, and congratulations again. Well done on the book, which is now available from bookshops and the RIA website, ria.ie/publications. Thank you very much, Anthony, and look forward to seeing you soon. And thank you again to everyone who joined in this evening.
Thank you, Dónal. Thank you, everyone.